It seems like everywhere you turn these days, atheism is kind of having a moment. It's like you
Yes.
can't escape the conversations about people leaving traditional religion behind.
Right. It's everywhere you look.
And you know what? You, our listeners, you guys really get it because you sent us some fascinating stuff that really digs into this whole shift.
Absolutely. And I think it's some seriously thought-provoking material.
It is.
We're going to be looking at the work of Mohammed Saeed Raslan as laid out in his work translated by Omar bin Ahmed Tohamy.
Okay.
You can find this on the Sheikh Mohammed Saeed Raslan transcripts website.
Perfect.
And what's really cool is that this is based on a bunch of lectures he gave.
Okay.
And the translator even included a link to the YouTube videos.
Oh, wow.
You can actually see and hear the original discussions, which adds a whole other dimension to it.
Yeah, that's fantastic for context.
It is.
So let's be clear about what we're doing here today.
Okay.
This deep dive isn't just about saying, oh, hey, look, atheism is on the rise. We're really trying to grasp why this source says it's happening.
Exactly.
And there's this really intriguing idea we're going to explore called the polytheism of atheists.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
It really gets you thinking.
It does. So our mission here is to take all the main points from the text,
Yeah.
break them down in a way that makes sense so that you, the listener, can really get a good understanding of what's being said.
And hopefully not get too lost in the academic jargon.
Exactly. We want to keep it clear and engaging for everyone.
Absolutely.
So let's dive in.
Okay.
The text starts by talking about the historical connection between science and religion.
Right at the beginning.
Yeah, and it specifically points to this historical tension between science and the Western Church.
Okay.
And it's not just about scientific disagreements.
It goes deeper than that.
It does. It talks about moral and political clashes that arose with the church.
Yeah, there were a lot of power struggles going on.
Exactly. And there's this really powerful quote from a historian of atheism that's in the text that kind of sets the stage for this whole point.
Oh, I remember that one. What does it say again?
It says that Western churches were part of the problem.
Oh, yeah.
And get this, the soil that produced atheism.
Whoa, that's a strong statement.
It is. It paints this picture where the actions and positions of the church unintentionally pushed people away from belief.
So you're saying it wasn't necessarily the idea of God itself that turned people off?
Right. It was more about the issues people had with the institution and its representatives.
Interesting.
So as the text explains it, this resulted in many people who still believed in a creator feeling like they needed to distance themselves from organized religion.
They didn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
Exactly. They saw the problems as stemming from the institution, not the core belief in a higher power.
Okay, I can see that.
Now the deep dive moves on to the influence of philosophers.
And other thinkers.
Yeah, and this is really interesting because it talks about philosophers who believed in a creator, but whose ideas kind of paved the way for atheistic thought later on.
You mean even though they believed in God, their ideas helped create the conditions for atheism?
Precisely. It's like this idea of unintended consequences.
Okay, now I'm curious. Give me an example.
Okay, so the text uses René Descartes as a key figure.
Oh, Descartes. Yeah, I've heard of him.
Right. So his theory was that after God created the universe, nature became independent and followed its own laws without God constantly intervening.
So God kind of set things in motion and then stepped back.
Exactly. And the text argues that this was a really significant step in the development of atheistic thought.
Why is that?
Because even if you believe in a God who's not directly involved in everything that happens, it shifts the focus away from this idea of an active and present God.
I see. So people start thinking, maybe we don't need God as much to explain how things work.
Right, exactly. And this eventually leads to what the text calls the concept of a negative creator.
A negative creator, what's that?
Basically a distant and uninvolved God who's not really engaged in the day-to-day workings of the world.
Interesting. So even though they're not saying there's no God, they're making God less and less important.
Precisely. And the argument is that this eventually makes the idea of God almost unnecessary.
Which he fades into the background.
Exactly. And then the discussion brings up figures like Einstein and George Smoot.
Oh, yeah. Those are big names in science. People always bring them up as examples of scientists who believe in God.
Right, but the text offers a slightly different perspective.
How so?
Well, for instance, Einstein's famous quote about God not playing dice.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
It wasn't necessarily a statement of traditional religious faith.
What was it then?
The text explains that it was more a metaphorical way for Einstein to express his belief that the universe isn't governed by pure randomness or chance.
Oh, I see. So he was using God as a metaphor for the order and laws of the universe.
Precisely. And then there's George Smoot.
The cosmic background radiation guy.
Yeah, he famously said after his discovery, if you're religious, it's like seeing God.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but the text points out that in his book, Wrinkles in Time,
I've read that.
Smoot seemed to kind of backtrack a bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he clarified that he was using God metaphorically to convey the awe and wonder of his discovery, not necessarily as a literal affirmation of a divine being.
That's interesting. So even these prominent scientists, who are often cited as believers, might not have held conventional religious views.
Right, and this brings up a really fascinating point about the cultural context surrounding belief in science.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, it almost feels like there's this unspoken pressure, especially within some scientific circles, to kind of downplay or even hide any personal belief in a creator.
Like it's not the cool thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. The text even touches on this sense of unease or even shame that some scientists might feel expressing such beliefs publicly.
Wow. So it's almost like atheism is seen as the default or the more intellectually sophisticated position in those circles.
Right, and that can definitely make it harder for people to openly discuss their faith if they have one.
I see that.
Now, the next reason the text explores for the rise of atheism has to do with the role of wars and tragedies that are often blamed on religion.
Oh, this is a big one. You hear this argument all the time.
You do, don't you? It's a common one.
Especially in the West, people point to all these historical conflicts and atrocities.
Yeah, and they say it's all because of religion.
Right. Religion is the root of all evil, they argue.
And this has led to a general aversion to religion.
Oh, for sure. People see it as a source of violence and suffering.
Exactly. And the text includes this quote from Peter Medawar to illustrate this point.
What does it say?
It talks about the high price of blood and tears that humanity has paid for the comfort of religion.
Yikes. That's pretty intense.
It really drives home this idea that religion has caused immense suffering throughout history.
But I'm guessing the text doesn't just leave it there, right?
You're right. It offers a counter-argument.
Okay, I'm all ears.
It stresses that we need to be fair and scientifically rigorous when examining this claim.
So don't just jump to conclusions, basically.
Exactly. We need to carefully look at different religious beliefs and not lump them all together.
That makes sense. Different religions have very different teachings.
They do, and we also need to dig deeper into the real causes of these conflicts.
So you're saying we need to ask, were they actually caused by religion or by something else?
Right. Were they driven by political exploitation misunderstandings or injustices that just used religion as a cover?
So religion might have been used to justify the conflict, but not the actual cause.
Exactly. And the text uses examples from Islam to demonstrate this point.
Okay, give me an example.
It mentions specific Quranic verses that warn against exploiting religion for personal gain.
That seems pretty relevant to today's world, too.
It does, doesn't it? And it also talks about hadith that speak about groups who twisted religious teachings to support their violent actions.
So the text is saying that authentic religious teachings often condemn the very things atheists use to reject religion.
Precisely, it's pushing back against this oversimplification.
I like it.
And then it throws out this really thought-provoking question.
Hit me with it.
Did wars actually stop when secularism came along?
That's a good question. I mean, we had 2 world wars after the so-called Enlightenment.
We did, didn't we? And the text points to those wars as well as conflicts stemming from colonization and more recent wars in places like Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Yemen.
So plenty of examples of really destructive wars that weren't based on religion.
Exactly. And the argument is that if wars in the name of religion are a reason to reject religion, then secularism with its own bloody history should face even stronger opposition.
That's a powerful point.
Yeah.
It challenges this assumption that getting rid of religion automatically leads to peace.
Exactly. It makes you think about the root causes of conflict in a much deeper way.
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple issue.
It's not. And then the deep dive transitions to how atheists often portray religion as the opposite of science.
Oh yeah, you see that a lot these days.
All the time, right? This idea that you have to choose between faith and reason.
Like they're mutually exclusive.
Exactly. And the text identifies this as a key tactic used by atheists.
Okay, what is it?
It's creating this false dichotomy where religion is presented as being completely at odds with all the good things about science.
Like what?
Things like the scientific method, groundbreaking inventions, the growth of knowledge, and debunking superstitions.
So if they're saying if you want to be rational and modern, you have to abandon religion.
Precisely. But the text argues that this opposition only makes sense if you assume that religion and science are fundamentally incompatible.
Which they aren't necessarily.
Exactly. It's not an either situation.
It's more nuanced than that.
It is. And the text uses this analogy to illustrate its point.
Okay. I love a good analogy. Lay it on me.
Think about your senses and your mind.
Okay, got it.
We need both of them to understand the world, right?
Yeah, we use our senses to gather information and our minds to process it.
Exactly. So why should we have to completely abandon one in favor of the other?
They both have their own role to play.
Precisely. And the text even points out that early Muslim scholars actually helped lay the groundwork for the scientific method.
Really?
Yeah, it specifically mentions Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah.
I don't think I've heard of him.
Well, he's considered a very influential figure in Islamic thought.
Okay.
And the text credits him with establishing some of the core principles of the experimental method.
So they're saying that pursuing scientific knowledge is actually very much in line with Islamic tradition.
Exactly. It's not something foreign or opposed to it.
That's a good point to highlight.
And the deep dive emphasizes that science, while incredibly valuable, doesn't actually give us answers to all of life's big questions.
Like what kinds of questions?
Things like the purpose of our existence, the nature of the afterlife, questions about morality and values.
Yeah, science can tell us a lot about how the world works, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why we're here or what we should do with our lives.
Exactly, and that's where religion traditionally comes in.
It offers guidance and frameworks for understanding those deeper questions.
It does, and the text suggests that this need for deeper meaning is so strong that people might even hold on to religious beliefs even if they have some doubts about them.
Because it fulfills a deeper need.
Exactly. It's like this innate hunger for something more than just the material world.
Okay, I could see that.
And the text briefly mentions philosophers like Karl Popper and Steven Weinberg.
Okay.
And there's this quote from Popper that implies that wars are caused by irrationality.
So the more rational and scientific we are, the less likely we are to fight.
That's kind of the implication, but the text pushes back on this.
How so?
Well, it points out that throughout history, people have used worldly knowledge, including scientific advancements in warfare.
Yeah, it's not like science has prevented wars.
Not at all. And it also brings up examples of wars driven by things like racism and ethnic hatred.
So it's not just about religion versus non-religion.
Exactly. The motivations for conflict are far more complex than that. And the text also talks about the Islamic perspective on war.
Oh, that's interesting. What does it say?
It says that Islam views war as an inherent evil to be avoided whenever possible.
So not something to be glorified?
Not at all. There's even a hadith that discourages even wishing for an encounter with the enemy.
Wow, so peace is really emphasized.
It is, but it also acknowledges that war might be necessary in certain situations.
Like self-defense or to prevent a greater injustice.
Exactly. So it's not a pacifist stance, but it's one that recognizes the gravity of war.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, the fifth reason the deep dive explores for the spread of atheism is this claim that there's a fundamental contradiction between faith and scientific facts.
Ah, the classic science versus religion debate.
Right, and this is a central argument for many atheists.
Yeah, you hear it all the time.
And the text acknowledges that this claim is widely accepted, but it argues that it's not actually well-founded.
So they're challenging this popular narrative.
They are, and they use the example of the geocentric versus heliocentric view of the universe.
Okay, the whole Earth-centered versus sun-centered debate.
Right, and atheists often point to this as evidence that science disproves religion.
Like we used to think the Earth was the center of everything because of religion, and now we know better thanks to science.
Exactly, but the text points out that science itself has a history of being wrong.
Oh yeah, for sure. Scientific understanding is constantly evolving.
It is. For example, before the Big Bang Theory, scientists used to believe in a static and eternal universe.
That turned out to be incorrect.
It did. So the text argues that it's inconsistent to reject religion based on the changing nature of scientific understanding.
Especially when science itself is always being revised and updated.
Exactly, and the deep dive reminds us that this historical clash was really specific to the Western Church and its rigid stance on certain scientific matters.
Oh, right, like Galileo and the whole heliocentric controversy.
Exactly, and this led some people at that time to choose science over religion.
But the text emphasizes that this context doesn't necessarily apply to other faiths.
Right? Like Islam, which has a strong emphasis on seeking knowledge.
So it's important to be mindful of the historical context.
It is. And the text then addresses an argument made by Wayne Beer.
Wayne Beer. Okay, I'm listening.
He claims that because we now understand how celestial bodies work scientifically, they no longer point to a creator.
It's that whole, we know how it works, so there's no need for a who argument.
Precisely. But the text challenges this by asking some really fundamental questions.
Go on, I'm intrigued.
It asks, who made the laws that govern those celestial bodies?
And where did the bodies themselves come from in the first place?
Exactly. Just because we understand the mechanics of something doesn't mean there's no ultimate creator or designer.
Right, like if I take apart a watch and understand how all the gears and springs work, it doesn't mean the watch just magically appeared.
Exactly. It still needed a watchmaker.
That's a good point.
And the text uses another analogy.
I do love a good analogy.
It says that the human body is about 60% water.
Okay.
But knowing that fact doesn't make the human body any less complex or miraculous.
Right, it's still an incredible feat of engineering, whether we understand its composition or not.
Precisely. So the text argues that scientific knowledge should actually inspire more awe and wonder, not less.
I like that perspective.
Now, the sixth reason the deep dive explores gets into this interesting philosophical area, the false dichotomy between divine creation and natural causes.
Okay, this sounds intriguing. Break it down for me.
It's this idea that if we can explain something naturally, it can't have been created by God.
Like if we can trace the evolutionary path of a species, it means there's no need for a creator.
Exactly. But the text presents the view of the Al-Sunnah,
Which is?
the majority branch within Sunni Islam.
Okay.
And they argue that Allah typically creates through natural causes.
So natural processes are actually part of God's creative plan.
Precisely. And it uses the example of human procreation.
Okay.
We know that parents are the natural cause of a child's birth.
Yeah, that's basic biology.
Right. But that doesn't mean God isn't the ultimate creator of life.
So natural processes and divine creation aren't mutually exclusive.
Exactly. They work together.
That makes sense.
And the text addresses this challenge atheists raise about finding natural explanations for things we used to attribute to God.
Like miracles or the design of living things.
Right. And it uses the author's own example about the intricate design of plants and animals.
Okay.
In the past, people saw that as clear evidence of a creator.
Yeah, it's hard not to see design in nature.
But now we have evolutionary explanations for those things.
So does that mean God is out of the picture?
Not according to the text. It argues that science primarily explains secondary causes.
Meaning?
It tells us how things work through natural laws and processes.
Okay.
But it doesn't necessarily answer the ultimate question of why those laws exist or what started everything in the first place.
So science is great at explaining the how, but not necessarily the why.
Exactly. And the text suggests that all these amazing scientific advancements, while beneficial, have also led some people to feel kind of overly confident in themselves.
Like, we don't need God anymore. We can figure everything out on our own.
Right. And it connects this to some Quranic verses that talk about human arrogance and transgression.
Oh, interesting. Those tying it back to religious teachings about human limitations.
It is, and it brings up the world wars as a stark example of this.
Oh, yeah, the destructive power of science unleashed.
Exactly. It's a reminder that scientific progress without moral and ethical guidance can be incredibly dangerous.
A sobering thought.
It is. And the text then points out a tactic it sees being used by secularists and atheists.
Okay, what is it?
It's this tendency to interpret scientific facts through the lens of atheistic theories.
So they see what they want to see.
In a way, yeah. And
Yeah.
then they present these interpretations as the only possible explanations.
And ignore any alternative viewpoints that might be compatible with religion.
Exactly. It's like a subtle form of intellectual bias.
I see.
And the text uses the example of what it calls the fanaticism surrounding Darwin's theory of evolution,
Okay.
where any challenges to the theory are often met with hostility instead of open debate.
So it's like they're shutting down any dissenting opinions.
Right. It's not a true scientific spirit of inquiry.
It's more about protecting their worldview.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really interesting point.
Okay, what's that?
The text explores the state of the Muslim world as a potential factor in the spread of atheism.
Now, that's not something you hear discussed very often.
It's not, is it?
Especially in the West, we tend to focus on our own internal debates.
We do, but the text argues that the perceived weakness and backwardness of the Muslim world, despite having what they believe to be the true religion, has led some people in developed nations to stay firm in their disbelief.
So they're looking at the Muslim world and thinking, if Islam is so great, why aren't its followers flourishing?
Precisely. It's like if this is the best path, why doesn't it lead to success kind of argument.
I can see how that would be persuasive to some people.
It can be, and the text even quotes a verse from the Quran,
Which one?
one that expresses a fear of Muslims becoming a stumbling block for disbelievers.
So it's acknowledging this concern.
It is, and it highlights the responsibility that Muslims have to represent their faith in a way that's appealing and inspiring.
A challenge for sure.
It is, and the text sees this perceived backwardness as a major shortcoming and injustice,
Injustice, how so?
because it's preventing the message of Islam from reaching its full potential and guiding humanity towards what it sees as true happiness.
Okay, that makes sense.
And finally, the deep dive concludes by delving into this idea of the innate human knowledge of a creator and this central concept called the polytheism of atheists.
Okay, this is the part I've been waiting for.
It's a big one, isn't it?
It is. It's a really intriguing idea.
So the text argues that deep down, all human beings have an intuitive understanding that a creator exists.
Like it's built into our very nature.
Exactly. It calls this monotheism of lordship.
Meaning?
The recognition that there's a supreme power who created and governs everything.
Okay.
And the text suggests that this is why prophets throughout history haven't focused on proving God's existence.
Because it's already assumed.
Precisely, their message was more about clarifying who that God is and how we should relate to him.
So it's not about convincing people that God exists, but about guiding them towards the right understanding of God.
Exactly. And the text then breaks down the three key components of what it calls obligatory monotheism.
Okay, I'm ready.
First is belief in Allah's lordship.
Meaning his absolute power and control over all creation.
Right. Second is belief in his perfect names and attributes.
Okay.
And third is belief in his sole right to be worshipped without any partners or intermediaries.
So it's about recognizing God's unique position and our relationship to him.
Exactly. And this understanding then leads to the concept of the polytheism of atheists.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting. How can atheists be polytheists?
Well, the text argues that even those who deny the traditional concept of God often end up attributing godlike qualities to other things.
Like what?
Things like nature, evolution, the universe itself.
So instead of worshiping a personal God, they worship these abstract concepts.
In a way, yeah. And the text argues that this is still a form of polytheism because they're ascribing ultimate power and creative agency to multiple entities.
So even in rejecting God, they're still seeking something to fill that ultimate void.
Precisely. And it gives the example of materialistic atheists who initially claimed that matter was eternal.
So they were attributing a divine attribute to matter itself.
Exactly. And then it points out how even prominent atheists like Karl Marx saw formless matter as more of a philosophical illusion than a real thing.
Interesting.
And it also highlights how atheists often use phrases like, nature did this, or evolution chose that.
Giving these concepts agency as if they're conscious beings.
Precisely. And the text argues that this is further evidence of this underlying tendency to attribute creative power to something even in the absence of a traditional God.
So even in denying God, we still have this instinct to look for a source of ultimate explanation.
That's the argument, and the text concludes by saying that even those who reject the traditional idea of God are, in a sense, engaging in polytheism.
Because they're attributing divine qualities to other things.
Exactly. It's like this deep-seated human need to acknowledge a source of ultimate power and existence.
It's really fascinating, isn't it?
It is, and it leaves us with a lot to ponder.
It does.
So to recap, this deep dive into Raslan's work has explored several reasons for the rise of atheism.
Oh, remind me what they were.
Historical conflicts involving religious institutions, unintended consequences of philosophical ideas, wars blamed on religion, the perceived clash between religion and science, claims of contradictions between faith and scientific facts, and this false dichotomy between creation and natural causes.
Wow, that's quite a list.
It is. And running through it all is this idea of the polytheism of atheists.
The idea that even without a traditional God, we still seek something to fill that ultimate role.
Exactly. And it really makes you think about this fundamental human need for meaning, for explanation, for understanding our place in the universe.
It does. It makes you question whether rejecting a traditional creator really solves the problem or just shifts it to something else.
It's a profound thought, isn't it?
It is.
And it's something worth reflecting on long after this deep dive is over.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking this journey with us.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.